We, like millions, are survivors of civil war. And we know all too well that peace does not begin simply because civil war ends. A peace treaty, a piece of paper alone, does not bring peace. It does not take back what has been seen, what has been said, what has been done, or take back what the war has changed in our streets, in our homes, in our hearts. It does not undo the suffering. For many reasons, there is still fear for our future and the future of our families. Yes, the war might be over, but the struggle to find peace continues. Many peace processes fail, perhaps because when peace is thought of as a process, we forget that what we are talking about is people, who for many just want to love and to live and to prosper. We, like millions, are survivors of civil war, but real peace is more than simply just surviving. It is a shared focus on a tomorrow that benefits all.
My name is Heidi, and I'm 11 years old. Once upon a time, I went on a sleepover, which was kind of big, because when I was 2, I found out that I had autism. But we worked hard, so I can do stuff like sleepovers. My first sleepover seemed like it would never come. But here I am. It took a lot of practice to get used to my sleeping bag, to get used to how it felt. We checked if I had everything I needed, like a million times. My favorite pillow, my headphones if it got too loud. I like it when I get to be just like other kids. Because I am just like other kids. And I have friends. And they have houses. And sometimes I sleep there. My name is Heidi. And I'm 11 years old. And I go on sleepovers all the time.
People of the Kulin Nation and thank them for their care of the land and pay my respects to their elders past and present. My name is Betty Lesk, Pro-Vice-Chancellor Teaching and Learning at La Trobe University. On behalf of the University, I welcome you to the 4th event for the Bold Thinking Series 2016. Is gambling a bigger threat to sport than drugs? Tonight, we'll hear from a panel of experts about the paradox of gambling in sporting organisations and the broader integrity issues around cheating to win and cheating to lose in sport. I'm very pleased to say that La Trobe is one of Australia's leading universities for sport-related teaching and research, and I'm delighted indeed that this topic is included in the Bold Thinking series. On tonight's panel, on my right, we have Professor Russell Hoye, Director of La Trobe Sport, whose research interests cover corporate governance, public policy, volunteer management, and the impact of sport on individuals and society. He has been Chief Investigator on 3 Australian Research Council grants and a Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council grant. We also have Catherine Ordway sitting in the centre, who is a Professor of Practice in Sports Management at La Trobe University. She's a specialist in anti-doping and code of conduct disputes. She appeared in over 30 anti-doping hearings in the lead up to the Sydney Olympic Games and works with the Australian Sports Anti-Doping Authority. Joining Professors Russell Hoye and Catherine Ordway is the AFL Players Association CEO Paul Marsh and leading investigative journalist Nick McKenzie. Paul Marsh, who's sitting here on Russell's right, has been the AFL Players Association CEO since 2014, and prior to that was the CEO of the Australian Cricketers Association. He's also served as the Executive Chairman of the Federation of International Cricketers Association, FICA, and been Chairman and Board Member of the Athletics Alliance Australia. Nick McKenzie, who's sitting on the right there, is one of Australia's leading investigative journalists, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with his face. And his writings. He has won Australia's highest journalism award, the Walkley Award, 7 times for his investigations into contemporary issues, including police corruption, corporate corruption, and organised crime and doping in sport. I'll now hand over to tonight's host, radio personality and former journalist Francis Leach, for what promises to be a robust discussion. Please join me in welcoming tonight's expert panel.
Thank you. Professor Long, thank you very much. Thank you for coming here tonight. It's great timing that we're holding this event at this particular time because it comes off the back of another Olympic Games. And as someone who grew up idolising the Olympic Games, today I had an amazing moment. Mac Horton came into my radio studio and he pulled out of his pocket his Olympic gold medal, and I held it in my hand, and the 10-year-old boy inside me nearly cried with joy. It was an amazing experience to hold it in my hand, and in a sense, it restored my faith in the idea of the Olympics, which I grew up with. I mean, I was a kid that loved the Olympic Games. At B.B. McKill, I was obsessed with that story of him running barefoot and winning a gold medal in the marathon, and any number of stories like that. Yet as a grown man over the last 2 weeks, I've looked at the start line at most Olympic events with a heavy heart and a jaded eye and wondered which clean athlete was amongst the cheats who were predominant there. And that had more to do with, I think, my view of world sport now than maybe it did of them, but unfortunately that's where we are when it comes to the world of sport in 2016, for better or for worse. And that's why a forum like this tonight is important to have this conversation. All of our panellists have an expertise in different areas of the fight against corruption and the maintenance of integrity in sport, and that's what we're going to explore with them this evening. But I guess the first thing we have to do when we're doing that is identify the threat itself. Just how real is it, and what is the future of sport if we indeed fail to meet it? So I'll start with you, Catherine. I'll start with you. Just how deep and how urgent is the threat to sport integrity at the moment, if you have an overarching view of sport around the world as we know?
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between cheating to win, which is doping that you mentioned already, and cheating to lose, which is becoming more and more prevalent. And that's the title of tonight's forum is gambling a bigger threat than doping? And I think gambling of itself is perhaps not the big issue. We could spend an entire night talking about whether or not we like gambling in sport, but it's here. What the issue is whether people are fixing and trying to determine the outcome in advance. Now, I didn't get a sense during the Olympic Games this time that that's what we had, that we had gambling-related integrity issues, but certainly in the lead up to Rio, doping was the big issue. So I guess they're the two main concerns for sport at the moment.
Russell, when you look at sport these days, does your eye trust what you see?
I think that still the fan in me tries to be quite naive in looking at sport in its pure sense. I think depending on which sport you're watching, if I'm watching some international soccer, I might have a different view. If I'm watching South American soccer, a very different view. And then I think it depends if you're watching under 12 soccer in Melbourne, I think it's a different view again. So it really depends on what sport you're looking at. International cricket, it's probably a bit of a, I would never bet on it or probably pay a subscription.
Paul, as somebody who's been involved from the point of view of the participants, from professional sports people, your level of trust in the integrity of what your members are involved in, when you watch a game of cricket, an IPL game, are you confident when you watch that the messages that you to your constituents have gotten through and that they're actually meeting the standard that you asked them to meet?
I've always thought that from an Australian perspective, I've never seen or had any reason to believe there was an issue with Australian cricketers, but there certainly have been times where, you know, we've seen games or parts of games that there's no doubt that there's been integrity issues. So look, I've seen firsthand, I've had players in my cricket days report integrity issues to me directly. So I know it exists in cricket and other sports. And so in my view, this is the biggest threat to the integrity of sport.
Is gambling,
I think
the money.
So. Match fixing, I think, is the biggest issue.
Nick, you've done it from the other side of the fence, watching people who've tried to affect the outcome of sporting events, when it's either drugs or gambling. If you had to choose, if we're going to make a choice, as the theme of this event is, gambling or drugs as a threat to the integrity of sport, which one do you reckon poses the biggest threat?
I'm going to be cop-out and say they both pose equal threats, and they're not mutually exclusive, because you can dope a horse. If it's going to go faster, you'll bet on it, and you're cheating and you're doping to win. And I guess in terms of my view, I've got this very jaundiced view, because my job is in finding the bad stuff, and I'm amazed how often cheating and corruption happens in Melbourne. I mean, there's syndicates with organised crime figures, notorious drug traffickers who have cups of coffee with AFL players, talent scouts. It's happening every day of the week, and people don't realise it's out there, but it's a genuine threat, and it's a serious threat. Of course, it's much better here than it is overseas, but with the globalisation of sport, with our cricketers going to India in the off-season, they're exposed. And I mean, the one rule of life is where there is money, there is corruption, and there's more and more money in sport, more and more gambling in sport, and there will be more and more corruption in sport.
Well, there is one example, not in Melbourne so much, but the Eddie Hastings example in Sydney is in some ways a perfect sketch of how that might operate. If people don't know that story, can you fill them in about the Eddie Hastings story and how that tangle web has drawn in NRL players, journalists and other high-profile figures as a sort of a DNA or a strain of the disease of cheating in sport? Yeah,
I've been told we're not in the defamation-free zone, so I'll be careful here. This will be broadcast online. But basically, Eddie Hastings, a colourful, massive punter. He moves a hell of a lot of money as a gambler and has forged these not unique ties. There's plenty of blokes like him, these colourful characters. He knows NRL players, top-tier NRL players very well. He knows organised crime figures well. He used to run a famous brothel called Stilettos in Sydney, where, you know, lawyers, journos, footy players, everybody passes through. He's a great cultivator of people and information. And he's also loves a punt and loves to win. And with all those factors, he's been at the centre of a number of gambling scandals where the allegation is that NRL players have passed him information or horse racing identities, inside information, or have collaborated with him to fix the outcome of sometimes, you know, tier one matches so he can win money. Now, that's not been proven, so you've got to stress that. But he's just a great example of the danger that's there when you've got somebody who does have that reach into professional sports, into organised crime, who's got money to play with, and is really, his friends would say he's a lovable rogue, and also has the media on side, so he can sort of float through all the different stratas of society. Having a brothel in Sydney as well is great, in his world, great cachet, or was. So his critics would say a real danger to the integrity of sport. His mates, supporters would say a great bloke who loves a punt. I'm not going to comment for legal reasons.
But it's interesting, I'll go to you with this, Paul, and then you, Russell, because if you read the Australian Crime Commission report that was released around the same time as the Asada investigation began into the Essendon Football Club in, was it February 2012, I think it was. That was at the core of what it wrote about. It basically talked at the heart of it about just how quickly the slide was for professional sports people and semi-professional sports people into the web of influence within organised crime. When you read that, did that come as a shock to you as somebody who's involved with professional sports people? Or did you get a sense that that was already a threat to the integrity of sport?
Well, I think, given my international experience in cricket, I've seen exactly that play out, particularly in the subcontinent. So that
how would it work? Tell us how it would work.
I mean, example, there was quite a famous case of a Pakistan player by the name of Mohammad Amir, who's just actually come back from, I think he had a 5-year ban, but he was basically, I suppose, groomed from the age of 15. They plucked him out as a talent. They put him into the National Cricket Academy in Pakistan, which a fellow called Salman Butt, who ended up being the captain of Pakistan, was there, and took him under his wing. And that then led into, I'll cut the story a bit short, but that then led into an introduction to Salman's agent. The agent then started talking to him about, match fixing. The kid was 16, 17 by this point, had no idea about what all this meant. Was then sort of brought into a situation where he'd had a conversation that had been taped, and then therefore he was incriminated. And then the question was popped, and the agent said, ask your captain, by this stage was the guy Salman Butt, whether this is all okay, and the captain said yes, and all of a sudden he's bowling no balls in a test match at Lords. The News of the World have got hold of the sting and he's in jail, along with 2 other teammates. So often it's a young kid being groomed from a very early age, and they're in the middle of something that they just can't get themselves out of. And there are heaps of examples in world sport of these type of things. And a lot of it's just this, young, innocent, stupid, whatever, but all of a sudden their lives are ruined by it. And the people that are approaching them are criminals. Now, it is organised crime because they see they can make money off the back of an action that they can control on the field. So it's definitely happening. Was I surprised to see? I mean, I think that report was a beat up in many respects.
In what ways do you think?
I don't think it's been proven to be accurate as it was laid out that day. And I haven't seen... Look, there are certainly examples like Nick's talked about, whether that's following through with players actually fixing matches in this country. I'm not so sure about that. But I think the 2 sports, I guess, that I've worked in, mainly cricket, the players in this country are well awake to the threats here. I probably see a bit less so with AFL. I'm not sure that this has really hit our code so much yet. But the fact it's happening in rugby league is of concern, and it's something that we're very awake to.
Russell, I mean, the story that Paul paints there reminds me in a way of the story of Sonny Liston, 40 years ago, who was born and basically became a creature of the mob as a boxer and had to basically be at the beck and call of his paymasters right until he died. But it's different now, isn't it? Because what we have is a more sophisticated organisation, a trans-global culture, which is so much harder to police, and a more sophisticated approach to cheating where it's not just about winning and losing, but it's within the match, within the contest itself, where you could be bowling no balls and affecting the outcome of matches, but more importantly, delivering a payday to those who you're working for.
Now, if you look at the recent...
You really are.
No one wants to hear me tonight.
We'll get you a bullhorn next, or a carrier pigeon. How are we going there, Russ?
Am I on?
You are.
Great.
Yeah.
Better say something worthwhile now.
You better.
So I think... Repeat the question again.
Just how much more sophisticated it's become. It's transnational now, which makes it a lot harder to police, and also the fact that we've gone from the brutality of winning and losing and taking a dive like Lister might have been accused to, maybe now it might be losing a round, or in boxing parlance, or it might be bowling no balls but not trying to necessarily lose the game.
Yeah, and I think Catherine's comment at the start tonight about where corruption is within sport. It starts at the very top, and you've seen the IOC, FIFA, International Cricket Council, all those governing bodies who are supposed to be the police of corruption in their respective jurisdictions are corrupt themselves. So I think some of those insidious practices have been bred from the top, and it's very hard to get real policing effectively done within a sport without an independent body to actually oversee that. And that's some of the challenges about having that that global challenge, and things like cricketers who are playing in maybe 5 or 6 leagues a year in limited overs cricket and T20 tournaments, they're going from place to place in different regimes and different levels of policing of their behaviour. It changes dramatically about where they are, the jurisdictional powers of each of the governing bodies for sport.
The IOC, the big moment came for them, and it was amazing when Sir Philip Craven with the Paralympics, and his quote would gladden the heart of anyone who wanted somebody within the power structures of international sport to stand up and be counted. And I'll read you what he said when he banned the Russian Paralympic team at the time. He said, "I believe the Russian government has catastrophically failed its para-athletes. Their medals over morals mentality disgusts me." Why didn't we hear that from the IOC? Because the same principle surely applies, but they didn't have the courage to follow through.
Well, I think your point is right. It is about courage. And Russia is one of the superpowers of sport in the world, absolutely. We're not dealing with a country like Kuwait that they were able to sideline and suspend their membership because they felt that there was political interference in Kuwait. Nobody was crying out for the Kuwaiti athletes to see them in Rio. But when it was the scenario for Russia, it was completely different for the IOC. And I found it quite perplexing to understand the IOC position when they were looking at WADA and blaming WADA for their negligence because they weren't heavily testing Russian athletes enough or making sure the international federations were, when actually the International Olympic Committee half funds WADA and they sit around the board table. So the International Olympic Committee representatives are all there and they're going to the meetings in Montreal every quarter or however often the meetings are. So if WADA's not doing what they should be doing, then what's the IOC doing about that? They have had their opportunity. So I found their decision quite bizarre.
What was at the heart of it? Was it and this gets to the interesting point about the international institutional codependence. So the IOC feels it can't, blanch Russia because the consequences for them down the track, whether it's in commercial terms or future events, are too great, or that they are maybe in hock to certain Russian institutions and or people, that they don't want to ruin those relationships or be exposed for that.
I think there might have been two things at play. One is you look at how expensive it is to host an Olympic Games, and there are a limited number of countries around the world that can do that. We saw how the position changed for Brazil from when they received the hosting rights in 2009 to their financial position today. It's really put them through the ringer. There are not many other countries that want to put their hand up for an Olympic Games. Russia is one of those that has hosted the Games recently.
Has the World Cup coming up in 2 years' time.
Has the World Cup coming up. And there aren't that many countries. So they want to keep in sweet with those countries, I guess, that have the capacity to do it. Otherwise, they're going to run out of contenders. That's one side.
So different rules for some because of their power.
Maybe. The other side too is that in terms of an Olympic brand, they want to have the best athletes on the stage. So at Rio, the argument was, we want to see the fastest, highest athletes competing. And if we wipe out the whole of the Russian team, that was going to be 400 athletes that we wouldn't get to see perform. And is that in the best interest of the Olympic brand? I think that was the question that went through.
Can I make a point here? I don't know if you can hear me still. It's about money though, isn't it? I mean, this is about, they've sold television rights for the Olympic Games, they want the best athletes to come. So now there are sports that are covering up what's going on. WADA perhaps isn't as effective as it should be. The IOC isn't actually taking the decisions it should take because they've sold rights for billions of dollars and they want the best people there.
So are we at a point, and this is the crucial question for fans of sport, where it no longer matters? I mean, I was amazed, and Waleed Ali's a colleague and friend of mine, and I heard him on Offsiders on Sunday and talking about Usain Bolt running beautifully. Now, the internal Jamaican doping processes are terribly flawed. And Catherine, you probably know about this more than anyone. They've had numerous problems in verifying the authenticity of those tests, the independence of those tests. They've had a number of athletes banned over the last 3 or 4 years. There's serious questions about Usain Bolt's running because of that. And Waleed said straight out, I don't care. And he was genuine about it. It just looked beautiful. Are we at that point now where it no longer matters because it looks beautiful and sport has simply become entertainment and to hell with integrity? I'll go down the pedal and I'll start with you, Russell. Are we at that point?
Well, I think when you think about the drugs issue, it comes down to the equity issue. So a lot of athletes may have access to the same amount of drugs or the expertise to actually deliver an actually performance-enhancing dosage to actually come up with a better performance. Some athletes won't have access to that. So if you open it up to a level playing field, it's still not going to be even. So if you legalise drug taking in sport and say, okay, let's produce the fastest human on earth and let the sports science take total control over that, you're still going to have an inequity field between the poorer nations and the richer. So you're still going to have an uneven field.
Someone will have a richer, stronger monster.
Yep.
Could you imagine a time when we'll get to that, Paul? If the money's the only thing that matters?
I hope not. I mean, I think the people that are most affected, in my view, by cheating are the athletes themselves. You know, let's look at the Olympics. They've trained for however long to get there on the day, and they want an equal chance of success, and they're being robbed of that by someone who's cheating. But I don't think sport's actually empowering the athletes themselves to try to solve this problem. You know, there are some sports where I think that is the case. I think golf's a great example. The athletes are empowered to call up any player that breaches any sort of rule. I don't know if you saw the female golfer a few weeks ago in one of the major championships who golf, which I play a lot of, is a really stupid game in terms of the rules of it. If you put the ball in the bunker and you touch a grain of sand in the bunker, you'll get penalised. Well, this female player, she did that and she lost the tournament because of that. But golfers are, it's culturally the way to go forward is to actually call it up. And I don't think we've made an effort in sport. I don't think the sports have empowered the athletes to try to take an approach like that across the board. Now that's a big cultural shift, but the athletes I think are part of the solution here, whereas in most cases they're actually not the cause of the problem. It's others that are trying to corrupt them from a match fixing perspective or in a doping perspective. The biggest issues we've seen are clubs, governments, institutions actually systematically doping athletes. So I think that's part of the solution.
Yeah, or in the Armstrong case being too big to fail, like the UCI turning a blind eye to his cheating because he delivered the circus that had delivered the rivers of gold. But I'm interested with you, Catherine, and I'll ask you, Nick, about this as well. We got to a point with the Rio Olympic Games where even the testing itself was considered to be haphazard. It was amazing for many of us to discover about 2 months out from the Games that the lab that was set up to govern the testing at the Games was actually basically pulled down, shut down because it hadn't met standards. 2 months out from the Olympic Games, they weren't going to use the lab that they'd been building and they had to basically come up on the run with a testing regime which, from what you understand, was appallingly short of what was required. What does that say about how highly valued the integrity of sport is when it comes to doping at, say, the Olympic Games?
That's correct. It was, it sounded like a bit of a schmozzle at Rio, to be honest, in the anti-doping setting. And it will be very interesting to see what the World Anti-Doping Agency independent observer report is like. At every major event, WADA sends in a group of independent observers and they have a look at the doping control process to see that it's being done in accordance with the international standards. So there are international standards for the laboratory and that's the one that the Rio lab failed in, and that not for the first time, but we haven't seen that happen immediately before a major event like this before. But it's also the doping control process, the training of the staff, and you know that one of the most crucial elements in the whole chain of custody is the witnessing of the sample, and only the athlete and the chaperone are there during that process. So the system falls down completely if the chaperones, A, don't show up, or if they accept a bribe, or if they are turning their head away and haven't been trained properly or something like that. So it'll be very fascinating to see from the WADA Independent Observer report how well the process was done, because the reports at the moment are that they weren't done very well at all.
Nick, when we look at the processes itself, let's look at the Asada case against Essendon and the way that was conducted. And that was a real revelation for a lot of people here in Australia about the nature of doping control and how it works, and how an organisation like ours was underfunded and not ready to deal with what was seen to be a systemic doping case within a major professional sport. I mean, you covered that pretty widely. Just how underprepared was Asada for the circumstance with which it was confronted?
Before I get to that, I mean, we do have a system, or systems in place in Melbourne, let's go local, that are set up to catch cheats. You've got the Graham Ashton, our Chief Commissioner, who's made it really one of his key issues in the last few years about cheating, doping in sport. He set up a sports integrity unit. It's got phone taps. You had the Piranha Task Force. the most well-resourced organised crime task force looking at this very issue for a number of years. You've got Sal Perner, the Sports Racing Integrity Commissioner. You've got the AFL, just hired the ex-head of Piranha. They've got lawyers, ex-coppers. They're all out there trying to catch these guys and trying to improve the system. And it often works really well. People get caught, and and that's a huge deterrence for them. The athletes who get caught, the amount of shame and the deterrence value throughout their sport and across the world, if it's a global sport, can be immense. So it's not all bad. Where there's money, there's corruption, of course, but there are these great systems in place. And the challenge really is, the major challenge is the globalisation of gambling, online gambling, the science, doping is going so fast. ASADA tackled those problems, the science problems, because it had this new murky world of peptides. A law enforcement agency in the ACC first tackled the Australian Crime Commission, looked at this as a law enforcement problem, where you had organised crime overlapping with sports scientists, importing funny peptides into the country. There was this murky area as to what was legal and not legal. And then ASADA was doing the job of cop, of scientist, which is a really complicated, resource-intensive job against immensely powerful interests. The AFL, Essendon itself, the NRL, the clubs involved at the individual level up in New South Wales.
And politicians at a federal level.
Politics, yeah. And it was it mishandled? Yes. Was it clumsily handled? Yes. Is there any one party to blame? Not really. You can actually understand why many things did happen. The conspiracies which you read about in the press largely didn't happen. There weren't people plotting in people's kitchens about how to defeat the Australian Crime Commission. There weren't tip-offs. That's been blown out of proportion.
More incompetence, is it?
More incompetence, yeah. And a system trying to really struggle against all these competing pressures, from the political pressures to the basic question of science. But at least the system was in place. And I think what we did see at the end of the day, love or hate the result, was some level of accountability, where ultimately this international body stepped in and said, no, these are the global rules and this is what you're going to play by. And we all know what the outcome is.
And that comes to the issue of the players, Paul. And this gets to the very heart of the foundation stone. If we're talking about doping in sport, it can only, a regime of enforcement can only really exist and run on a single principle of strict personal liability. Because at the end of the day, the athlete has to take full ownership of what's in their body, and everything flows from that. Yet the Essendon players predominantly were arguing counterintuitive to that they didn't know and therefore they weren't responsible. What's your position on the idea of strict personal liability as the bedrock for integrity in team sport?
Well, I think it's important to note that Essendon players never tested positive, so the strict liability is irrelevant in this case. There was never a positive drug test. So strict liability means if it's in your body and you test positive, then you've basically got to prove that there's a reason why it's in there that's not against the anti-doping code. So I'm happy to answer your question. I'm not sure it's relevant on this particular point, though.
Okay, well, let's just talk about the notion of strict personal liability. Do you believe it should be the cornerstone of what is, the responsibility of athletes when it comes to protecting the integrity of the sports that they play and participate in?
I've never quite understood why we can't handle these cases like you would in a court of law and actually look at the facts in front of you. And yes, if there's something in an athlete's body, they've got to prove why it's in there, and it wasn't because they were trying to cheat. But you get smart people in every other walk of life able to actually sit down and judge a case on its merits. The WADA code is, in my view, completely inflexible. If it's in your body, now you're looking at a 4-year ban. There are times where there may be plausible reasons, but we jump straight to guilt every time there's a player who has a positive anti-doping test. And that, I've seen players' careers ended. I mean, you're a huge soccer fan. Stan Lazaridis is a great example. His career was ended on the back of a substance that was removed from the doping list literally months after that had happened. So there's no flexibility in this code, and I think that's one of the big issues.
And that wasn't him trying to cheat either, just to be clear about the Stan case, if people don't remember that one.
And look, in my early days in cricket, there was a young state cricketer who had been given a substance by his own doctor to remove a boil on his back. And this was just before the WADA code had come in. The facts were heard. He was guilty of taking the substance. He got a 1-month suspension. If that had happened another year or so later, he was looking at 2-year ban. Everyone knew he didn't do it to cheat. Now, I think that's part of the problem. I want to make the point that we do believe in anti-doping. We believe that cheats should be heavily punished, but at the moment, there's just too many athletes who aren't cheating, in our view at least, that have been kicked out of the sports for 2, and now it's 4 years. And that's where one of the biggest flaws in the system is from where we sit.
Catherine, you've been heavily involved in any number of cases. Part of what you've done as a solicitor over the years has been involved in the Court of Arbitration for Sport and representing there. What did you think of Paul's attitude towards it? And what's a middle path then if Paul's correct that hard line when it comes to strict personal liability is too hard?
Yeah. And I do appreciate the position of that Paul's taking in the athlete's position. I think that the anti-doping movement has grown a lot and learnt a lot over the years. It took certainly a very hard line at the beginning. We had people going out for 2 years for marijuana back when I first started doing prosecutions, and that's just ludicrous. People are not feeling like we need to smash every athlete that comes back with a positive test anymore. There's a greater understanding now about the contamination of supplements, for example, than there ever used to be. So they've tried to soften the code whilst creating a standardised and harmonised system. Because we've seen the scenario from the McLaren report where in Russia you have a system that breaks down, and on the horizontal we have the International Athletics Federation where the system breaks down. And if you don't have some blanket rules that apply to all countries, then suddenly you have a scenario where we say, well, obviously our athletes wouldn't cheat here in Australia. They're all very lovely, and we can understand that there are reasons for why they would have taken it. It's finasteride, it's a hair loss product, it's something like that. That's very lovely. But if that happened to a Chinese athlete that we were racing against, if that happened to a Russian athlete that we're competing against, then of course the excuse is just being made up to cover up. And that's where the system breaks down, and they've taken a very hard line and created the strict liability principle, which we do see in other parts of the law. We see it in drink driving, for example. The police will pull us up and we have to blow into the bag, and there's no, well, it was my friend's 21st party or something or other else, that's why I've got the high reading. You don't get to argue that. It's strict liability.
And I know there was no actual doping found in the Essendon players' systems, but one thing that scandal really, at least surprised me, is that I think not one player spoke out and challenged the team culture, which is defensible to the extent that some are young, they were following a very powerful hierarchy, but the reason you have that personal liability or individual responsibility built into the code is ultimately the pressures can be so immense, you do need athletes to take responsibility. And the failure to have that individual culture and that sense of personal responsibility at Essendon, we know what the cost of that has been. And I hope that's something the AFL, I'm sure, has picked up to say to players, yes, you're part of a team, but you've got to look after yourself as well. Seek a second opinion. Ask questions, because it's your job, it's your career on the line at the end of the day.
And it's also the wider philosophical question, Russell, isn't it, that athletes who are participating in professional sport have a responsibility to the integrity of their sport for future generations. It's one of the things that I've found mystifying about the Essendon situation, a lot of people didn't seem to want to talk about, was that if a regime of peptides was institutionalised within football clubs and became standardised, we would have got what we got with cycling for about 5 years, and that's young professional cyclists turning up to tour with European teams and then being confronted with a choice. If you want to be a professional cyclist, you have to get on the program, because if you're not on the program, you're not going to be riding for one of these teams. So your choice is your career, and that means doping or going and getting a real job somewhere else. If we'd allowed peptides to become standardised across the AFL the way that it was heading, then young aspiring professional footballers coming out of the TAC Cup would have been presented with the same question. Do you want to play AFL football? Well, all of these AFL clubs are now using these cutting-edge, up-to-the-line peptides. We're not quite sure what they're going to do to you, but if you want to play, you're going to have to use them, or else it's back to the VAFA. And that's the question that clubs and sports and players have to be mindful of, is it not, that they are responsible for those that come behind them?
Well, I think every player who's playing a sport, whether they be at sub-elite, elite or mainstream professional sport, have an enormous responsibility to adhere to the codes of the game that they're playing, but also to be the role model. And they're often held up as role models, clearly, for younger athletes. But you have to understand the reality of an 18-year-old professional athlete under enormous pressure for performance, going just recently out of adolescence, having to cope with fame, social media, having a salary, having a really regimented workplace environment, particularly in AFL football. The pressures are enormous. So you're dealing with people who are not quite ready for that in some cases. So I think some of the nuances of understanding the reality of an individual, and I think your comment, Nick, around none of those players speaking up speaks to volume to that. If you're an 18-year-old in that environment, how do you feel empowered to do that? If you are recently joined and that's in your second week you're asked to start doing this stuff, it's very difficult to speak up against that.
Can I just make a point? I mean, I think some of what Nick says there is fair, but the players did speak up. They actually did go to the club. They did ask the club to give them some sort of a undertaking that what they were being given was not banned under the code, and the club gave that undertaking. So they didn't go outside of that, and I think in hindsight they should have. I wasn't at the PA at this point in time, but I think they should have come to the PA. They didn't. But this is where I think the code isn't flexible enough, because I don't think anyone who looks at this case would say that the Essendon Football Club shouldn't have had the book thrown at them. No, absolutely, they gave undertakings to the players, they instituted this program, they should have had the book thrown at them. But should have the players been banned, have had a year? Well, I mean, really, it's been three now, probably close to 4 years of their football careers taken off and their lives taken off them because of this whole issue. And I don't know what the people in the room think, but not many people I've spoken to hold the players accountable here. They think it's the club's issue. Yes, the players could have done a couple of things differently, but did they set out to cheat? I certainly don't think they did.
Can I ask you, just on Russell's point, are the players, professional young footballers, and I guess it'll extend across other codes now, more empowered to question what they're being asked to do in that club and that team environment now? As a players' association, as a peak body for players, are we getting better at teaching young men that they have a responsibility to speak up for themselves?
Yeah, I think so, but you've got to understand too that the culture of these teams is 18 teams competing against each other week after week, and there are some things that they will not talk about. And this was classed as one of those things from the players, and they won't talk about game plans, they won't talk about training regimes, because it's all competitive advantage stuff, and that's how they saw this issue, rightly or wrongly, and to their detriment in the end, but that's how they saw it.
And I think that is one of to pick up on your point, one of the ways that the WADA code doesn't deal with the harmonisation approach appropriately, is that they don't distinguish between the team sports that are week in, week out, and the individual athletes. And the individual athletes, you can argue, perhaps don't have the same powers too, because they have a coach, and they might have, you think about the Kim Brennan scenario where she thanked her coach after her gold medal, that they'd been working together one-on-one for 11 years. Now that's an incredibly strong bond, and there's no suggestion there's doping involved here, but if in that strong relationship you were asked to dope, would you be a strong enough character to go against it? On the other side, the team environment, I understand we've seen it in cycling in the pelotons, we've seen it through the Essendon case, where they're saying, well, these are young athletes and they don't have the strength of character to step up and go outside and to even ask the club doctor in that scenario for more information. So is the code too onerous, and should we be taking more of that into account? And I think your point is right, that we need to involve the athletes more in the development of the code so that we hear from them and we can get a better understanding of what they want, rather than having a bunch of pale, stale and male blokes sitting around, in their late 70s, early 80s, making decisions about what's appropriate for 18 to 25-year-olds.
Can I ask about the other threat that we haven't talked about as much, and I do think we need to, because I think the predominant view here was that gambling and money are probably the bigger, more pervasive threat, because it does have a wider reach than maybe doping does. Nick, I think you wrote about a story here in Melbourne a couple of years ago, which is almost perfectly encapsulates how this particular form of gambling and match fixing insidiously works. And it's not necessarily about being at the MCG or playing at Amy Park and those players being at the heart of this, but it's much more likely to be in your local footy ground or your backyard. Tell us about the Stars soccer team and who was involved with that?
Yeah, it's an amazing case study where you had a bunch of guys whose aspirations, no doubt, one day was to play Premier League in the UK, didn't quite make it, struggled in the Tier 2, Tier 3 leagues, not getting paid too much, knocking around with each other. They start to get to know people perhaps in the murky side of European soccer, including a person called Perumal, who's the most notorious match fixer in the world. Apparently been involved in match fixing across Europe for many, many years. These players end up going to Melbourne and playing for the Southern Stars, which is a second-tier semi-professional football league, not getting paid too much. And it just happened, actually, the Stars aligned a betting data analysis company from overseas, which just looks at algorithms sucking up all the betting data across betting markets across the world. Saw this really odd punting on this low-level soccer in Melbourne. Now, it stuck out because there was so little volume and there was enough spikes to say something's wrong here. At that very point in time, you've got Victoria Police being the lead agency in Australia saying sports, gambling, corruption is an issue. Let's throw some detectives at this funny betting data and let's catch these guys like we would Tony Mockbell. So let's tap some phones. Let's do some surveillance, which almost never happens, unfortunately, in these sorts of crime types in Victoria and across Australia. It's too expensive. It's not seen as really high risk, high harm crime.
It's not going to deliver you a massive dividend, the police would think.
That's right. But they did this job in this instance. They tapped the phones, they observed the players, and they caught them on the phone through a middleman and sometimes directly to this guy Perumal, the assistant coach, or the coach was in on the giggle. And they were making paltry amounts of money for affecting the outcomes of games, so how many goals they'd win or lose by spot fixing, and there was betting happening on markets, I think, across Asia on these Melbourne games. And sure enough, the cops had enough evidence. They arrested these guys. They were put before our courts. They all got a slap on the wrist and sent home with their tail between their legs. None went to jail, as far as I can recall, which shows actually the penalties, the deterrence wasn't that great. But nevertheless, it was this great expose of this global organised crime gambling world impacting very, very close to home. And was that an extreme case? Well, yes, it was, but we don't know what else is out there. And for me, that suggests there is plenty of other ugly things happening around us in Australia that we're not looking at because we're not tapping the phones. We're not throwing that resource to uncover what's going on in those. The greatest risk are those second-tier leagues where people are hard up for money. And they can be bought for not much at all. People will sell their soul for very little, and that was a great case study of just that.
So it's like an infection looking for a willing host, isn't it? And Paul, you would, as you described earlier on about the young Pakistani player, it's about looking for someone who is able to be exploited. So it's often at that lower level of the sport, or semi-professional levels of the sport, that you will see players taking that main chance.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think, what we're seeing in cricket, for example, is the rise of domestic competitions through 2020. So we've got another, historically you'd be betting on the Australian cricket team versus Pakistan or India or whoever it might be. And there's 11 on each side. Now you've got a big bash where there's 8 teams. There's 88 players there who probably a bit more naive, not earning as much money. These games are now being televised around the world. A really important point to make here is that I read something recently, 90% of the betting is now in illegal offshore, with illegal offshore bookies. So it's not regulated. You can't control what bets are being laid. So at least with the betting companies that we'd all, if we have a bet, would put our money into Betfair and Sportsbet, etc. There are regulations around what the punters can actually bet on. But in these offshore illegal bookies, you can bet on anything. So in cricket, the extreme, and tennis has had the same issue. You've got these people they call courtsiders who sit at the ground with a phone ringing back to India before there's a gap of a few seconds from when the ball's bowled to when they're actually getting it in India, and they're having bets that they're televising it back over phone.
Yeah, twice last year at the Australian Open, I think they evicted people courtside, didn't they, from using who were seen to be using their phone in that capacity.
So I think these people are the, are the mafia types who, this is who's driving this whole market here. And with 90% of the money going to these illegal bookies, that's the big concern for me.
Kathleen, you also talked about reading some of your material about at the Olympic Games. I remember one story about a badminton match in 2012, which had, and once again, it's maybe a minor sport that's not attracting a lot of money, but players in that sport during the Olympic Games in London who were seen to be cheating to lose, as you like to say.
Yeah, that was a tanking scenario though, which is a bit different because there wasn't a suggestion that that was linked to gambling. So that's perhaps less of an evil.
Yeah.
Tanking is about trying to get a better run within the competition because the aim ultimately is still to win. So those badminton players from London Olympic Games, they just didn't want to meet China. I mean, who would when you're playing badminton? So they would, but both teams were trying to lose so badly that the audience started to scream because they're saying, we've seen better badminton at high school. Like, what's going on here? So that's different to the gambling related scenario that Paul was talking about then. And Nick's point too about the financial vulnerabilities of people, I think, is important because it's not just the young players that we're seeing that are being groomed. That's one scenario that's of concern, but it's also at the other end. The players that have been around for a long time that knows who's who in the zoo, they're also quite savvy about working out how they can maximise their profits at the end of their careers so that they can continue to enjoy their career a bit longer, perhaps sustain before they have to go into retirement and face the real world like the rest of us if they haven't made enough money to be able to retire to the Bahamas. So they want to try to get some money at the end. Declan Hill is one of the key investigative journalists in this space, and he's saying that's much more of a concern than the young up-and-coming players.
So that's more the profile you feel of athletes who are at that point in their careers?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what the research is coming out of what Declan's seen internationally. And he says that there's a distinction between those athletes that are looking to profit from a greed perspective and those that are concerned from a poverty perspective. So Declan points out it's a no-brainer when you're looking at the Nigerian football team, for example, who constantly goes on strike ahead of the World Cup or even before these last games in Rio because the team hadn't been paid. And so I understand that there was a Japanese businessman who flew over to Rio and said, fine, I'll pay you, Nigerian team, just go and play. And bizarrely, the Nigerian, somehow it turned out that the Nigerian administrators took the cash and said, leave it with us, we'll pay the players. The players received nothing, Japanese businessman lost his money, and the debate continues. So it's a very strange situation there.
Francis, I'm getting quite depressed with this debate because it seems that there's no end in sight, there's no improvement, sport's just going to go down the gurgler, so it just seems corruption's getting worse and worse. I don't see
give us a reason to believe, Russ.
Well, I can't hear a solution. I was really interested in Nick's view about whether we're doing enough to police, enough to educate, are we doing enough monitoring? What's wrong with the system that is affecting the behaviour here?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we haven't spoken about, the solution, and that was just on my mind as well. So we can control in Australia, and my expertise is in Melbourne and around here, we can control our lawmakers how we respond. So just recently there's cheating in sport laws, which create strict criminal liability, jail terms for those caught, which creates a really strong deterrence for players. But there's also, I mean, the main game, the future of this issue is the global battle, and ultimately you're going to need some sort of an anti-corruption global body. Yes, you laugh at it, look at the United Nations and how badly that works, but you need big data, mapping betting trails across the world as best you can and having some sort of a body that works a bit like Interpol, that when it looks at a risk will reach into a sports integrity body in Victoria Police or New South Wales Police. How come there's not one in SA Police or wherever around the world? So local responses, local laws, but also this global framework. I mean, that's the future. At the moment, I think the Hong Kong Jockey Club has the best analytics and algorithms in betting. They've got a huge amount of billions of dollars passing through the Asian betting dollar through the Hong Kong Jockey Club. Incredible systems to detect outcomes in sporting matches around the world which look sus, and then feeding them out to those sports clubs, those sports bodies and police. I mean, the other thing is just the institutions of sport. Like, look at Tennis Australia. Was exposed this year having a really, International Tennis Society or group, a really lacklustre institutional response to the threat of corruption. The media was a catalyst for exposing that. But what it showed was this sport, which of course knew about the dangers, at the elite international level not doing enough to counter it. And that's another part of this, of where there's a solution. And it is happening. There are bodies leading by example. And luckily in Victoria, we've got some of the best bodies, some of the best models underway.
But that institutional power in a state like Victoria isn't going to be reflected in a state like Nigeria, isn't it? And that's the real politic of anti-doping and anti-corruption, is that you're not going to have the same institutional strength or integrity to oversee a uniform approach to trying to protect the interests of sport. And maybe sport as an indulgence in a Western society like ours, it's fine to worry about the integrity of it, but if you're living in Nigeria and wanting to make a living, you're going to use sport however you can to get $1 in your pocket. And I'm sure that that's the sort of two-world scenario you find in your time in cricket, Paul, with the top-tier nations like Australia and England, and to a lesser extent, or the Indians now because of their financial power, and cricketers from other nations who have a very different set of circumstances under which they play and live.
Oh yeah, I mean, I might just pick up a couple of Nick's points. I mean, you talk about the betting data and the rest of it, but with 90% of the betting actually being done through illegal bookies, I'm not sure how you're actually ever going to track that. So, and if you try to drive, people away from gambling, they'll just continue to go towards these illegal bookies. So I don't think you can do exactly what you're talking about in that space. International harmonisation in this space, I think WADA's, and we'll probably have an argument about this, but I think that's been a failure. I don't see the relevance of trying to harmonise doping and corruption even worse.
So are we doomed?
No, I when you said you haven't heard a solution, my solution is I think we've got to do more to empower the athletes here. The athletes are the ones that have got the most to lose if fellow athletes are cheating. You put it in a team sport context, if one of my teammates is throwing games or throwing parts of games, then I don't want him on my team. And athletes know. I mean, I said before, I've had cricketers in my time call me up and say, I've just seen this happen, on the field. What do I do about it? And the problem at the moment is, in certain parts of the world, they're too scared to actually report to the authorities because the authorities are involved. So I've had a player, and I won't say where from, call me up and say, I've just had an approach from the owner of the team that I'm playing for to do this during a match. What do I do? I am frightened. I don't know how to get out of this country now. Help me. I'm not prepared to report it to the ICC because I don't trust them. But he rang me as the Players Association. So I think we've got to have a look at how we can empower the athletes here. Because from a doping perspective, once again, if I'm standing at the starting line, there's a good chance I'll know who's cheating and who's not. You talk to athletes and they'll say, I know that happened. But once again, are they trusting the people around them, the people that are running the sports? And we've touched on a number of the big sports, and there is corruption within them. So we've got to try to clean that up. The athletes at the moment, and you talked before, WADA have shunned the athletes associations at every step. They don't want to consult with us. They certainly don't want to agree with us on how policies should look. So the athletes are disenfranchised here, don't trust the authority. I think that's part of the reason we're in the mess we are.
So I started with my vision of the Olympic Games and how it looked to me at the start line. How did you feel watching it? I'll go along and ask everyone. Honestly, when you looked at the start line of, say, the 100 metres final, did you believe what you watched?
I mean, this is the other positive point about this, and I don't think the idea of global regulation, as idealistic as that, is mutually exclusive from culture and awareness and empowering players. That the two can operate. You need carrot and you need a stick. But when I look at sport, I mean, I don't think of, despite my daytime job, I love it. And I think of integrity. When the Olympics for me was a really positive experience, despite the negative headlines, because my sense is still that while there are some people who are cheating, when sport's all about fair play, and that's the ethic and culture of sport. And while that is key to my, that's why I love sport, then and that culture's through global sport, then I think it is going to be. It's not going to be perfect, but ultimately we'll keep at it. There'll be cheats, but ultimately there'll be also this great pressure for not a solution, but for better systems in place. And the fact that we're having this discussion, not just here but around the world, is heartening.
So what Nick's saying is it's still worth fighting for.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. I think the WADA system is flawed, but it's definitely not a failure. And I think it's the best model that we have right now and that we have to work with it. And I agree that we need to involve athletes more. We need to have greater diversity, not just pure geopolitical diversity, but we need to have age, culture, religion, gender. Goodness, that'd be nice. And actually look at what are the motivations for people cheating to win and cheating to lose. Is it that we have a bigger threat from a match-fixing perspective in women's sport now because some of the women's sports are being professionalised and they're getting televised, but they're not being paid particularly well. So is that actually a bigger threat for us than we realise, and is that under the radar? Do we actually need to spend some more time educating the female athletes?
That's a job that you'll be doing, Paul, because the AFL women's...
That is a real risk, you know, and I think, you know, when cricket first had its corruption problems back in, I think 2001 was around the time a fellow by the name of Sir Paul Condon did a significant report. What the athletes were getting paid was a huge catalyst for corruption. The lack of empowerment of the athletes, the governance of the sports, the things I've just talked about were the things that he identified as the issues. And, you know, female players who are trying to earn a living at the moment. I mean, the girls are going to play in the AFL comp next year are going to earn between $5,000 and $25,000. They're going to be expected to hold down full-time jobs, study, train, all the rest of it. Yeah, that's a risk.
And Russell, do you think fans still believe in sport?
Yeah, I think so. I'll look at the paradox of the comments that Paul just made around the burgeoning growth of female professional sport in Australia, where we've got, you know, women being able to play professionally for netball, football, AFL, a number of other sports. And if they're in that same growth stage where they're struggling for a wage, not being paid quite enough, there's a real risk there to get that wrong. But I think that I'm being suggestive here, that I think perhaps in the female sports space, there's more of a behavioural control mechanism at play, potentially.
Well, we've enough talking from up here. We want to throw the floor open to you to ask questions of our panellists from what you've heard tonight, or any other issues in relation to this particular topic, and maybe give us your verdict. Which is the bigger threat to the integrity of sport? Is it, in fact, doping or gambling? We have some microphones around, do we, Pierre? I think we might need to steal your microphone back from you, Paul. We're multitasking at the moment. So if you are going to ask a question, just identify yourself and direct your question to the person that you'd like to answer it, and maybe stand up so we can see you as well.
Hi, my name's Leon. I'm from La Trobe, but I'm also a parent, and I'm interested in your comments on the ubiquity of gambling in gambling advertising. My worry is that the kids today don't talk about the number on the back of the shirts, but the number for the odds. And I'm just wondering about your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll throw that to the panel. I mean, have we normalised, have we embedded gambling language and gambling culture into our spectator sports these days, Ross?
Yeah, I think we've had a couple of goes at this. So I think when the Victorian government, at least in this state, enabled sporting controlling bodies to actually form a wagering market to actually receive product fees from a wagering operator, it opened up the need to actually advertise gambling and connect that to actually sporting endeavours. And then I think about 3 years ago we had the bit of the furor around the massive saturation advertising by certain unnamed sports betting operators, and then the whole the telling of odds during commentating, the whole pervasiveness of the language, and that seems to have crept back in. So if you listen to any particular coverage of AFL, for instance, the odds are pervasive in the pre-game shows, the review, during the commentary. So it's insidious. So I think in that particular sport, and with NRL, it's pretty prevalent. I think in other sports, it's less so. Sporting codes which have in-game betting is even worse, because you actually bet during the game. So I think that whole pervasiveness is a worry. And some of the recent research out of, I think, Deakin Uni and Vic Health has sort of pointed to the fact that it's becoming more prevalent. And there is a link between exposure to sports betting, advertising and gambling and take up in later life.
Paul, of the Players Association's attitude towards it?
I don't know if you can hear me, but I think, look, I agree with what Russell said. I probably would make one further point in that the way the sports betting companies are marketing their products is a real concern. It's a very, very similar strategy that the tobacco companies rolled out, and it's sort of designed to get young people gambling. So we do have some concerns around that. It's, for all the reasons you've gone through, but also those.
Yeah, the challenge is, I think, for sports to work out ways to get some funding in and to be able to commercialise so that they're not so reliant on the taxpayer funds. And we've seen over the years alcohol sponsorship, tobacco sponsorship being taken away. There's suggestions about whether it's appropriate to have an alignment with fast food companies and so on. And gambling's the next one. When you've got gambling on the front of the shirts and so on, then it does become insidious and it normalises it. And then the question for the sports, of course, is, well, then what do we do about it? Who do we turn to then to use for sponsorship? Obviously, supplement companies are problematic for the doping side of things. So what are our options? And
the other thing the AFL often says on this issue is that by having a formalised relationship with a preferred sports bets company or with the betting companies, it has access to their data and it can therefore monitor whether players or other officials are involved in betting, which is detrimental to the integrity of their game. So they're, in a sense, they're making a pragmatic decision, they feel, that allows them to be able to police their sport.
It's about a commercial reality. Is it healthy? Oh, in many ways not, but if it's going to exist, at least watch it, regulate it, do your best to control it. And there is the good sports do have great relationships with betting companies who provide data. Some of the lesser sports don't bother to reach out or don't have those relationships, and some betting companies aren't as good or proactive as they should be as well in feeding data back, which creates another risk. So if it's going to be there, you've got to make sure it's being scrutinised, watched extraordinarily carefully.
Thank you for your question. We'll go to this side of the room, then we'll come to you, sir.
Thanks for that discussion. It's Alex Donaldson, also from La Trobe. I was really interested about the idea of empowering the athletes, and I think at Rio for the first time we saw the crowd getting involved in that, and we saw athletes getting involved with each other in that, in terms of negative feedback to those who were perceived to be drug cheats. Any feedback on that?
So, for instance, Mac Horton and Sun Yang, I spoke with Mac about this morning and asked him about his approach to that, and he was adamant. He said, yeah, well, I just believe in clean sport and I had a responsibility to speak out. And, I asked him, because he told me that he turned off his social media accounts after the number of awful messages hit 500,000. He had 500,000 comments on his Facebook page from people who were unhappy with his comments about Sun Yang. So he felt that it was his responsibility to do so. But my question is, why should it be left to the athletes to do that? Because that's, that can be a fairly lonely place. Surely their sports should be protecting them from having to be the foot soldiers for clean sport.
I think it's broader than just calling out the behaviour. I think, you can certainly. Some of the things I would suggest are, firstly, setting up a safe environment for players to report behaviour that they see, because they do see it, and that's the reality. In many sports around the world, they wouldn't feel safe in reporting it. So I think a whistleblower system through the player associations, I think, is key. I think building a real culture within sport that it's just not going to be acceptable.
A bit like in golf.
Yeah, that's the point I made before, but I can't think of another sport where that's central. Whether it be, cricket, for example, could take a stance on players walking. It doesn't do that. Players will try to cheat the system by leaving it up to the umpires to make the decision. There's lots of little things that athletes, if they're empowered, do. And that's a big responsibility and a big task, but I see that as one of the important solutions going forward.
I'd agree with that, to suggest that a whistleblowing system it's much preferable to having athletes call out from the pool deck or somewhere else. That's not the right way to handle this. And I actually think that Mac hasn't chosen the right athlete to call out either in this scenario. This is a one where I think that if the athlete was an Australian, we would have far more sympathy for them. This is an athlete who has, by the media reports, suffered a heart condition and took heart medication. He didn't get all the paperwork right for the therapeutic use exemption. He was given a ban and he served his ban in 2014. So he's now come back. So there's two things from that. Is he always a drug cheat? Is he forever a drug cheat? And do we use that kind of terminology? Is that helpful and is that healthy to speak about people in that way when they've served their time? And on the other side, was he really an athlete who was a drug cheat? Now, is it up to an athlete to make that decision when there is a process of investigation? If you have a proper whistleblower system set up, you can have the people who are knowledgeable in sports science or medical professionals or legal or whoever it is that's necessary to look into it, rather than athletes thinking that they know that people are cheating when they may be completely wrong. And some of the research has supported that a lot of the doping has been motivated by people thinking that everybody else is cheating, and actually that's not correct.
So you set up almost an arms race because of the fear.
Indeed.
For instance, in the racing industry, we've had whistleblowers, haven't we? The consequences for whistleblowers in sport when they do go public, and you would have dealt with a few who've talked to you over the journey, who've had the courage to talk about what goes on.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's whistleblowers everywhere, and our society tends not to support whistleblowers. They're seen as dobbers, especially in sporting cultures. And the vast bulk of my stories about, especially horse racing corruption, have come from people who've been very frustrated by the system. And there was a case of Damien Oliver, the champion jockey, much loved, and he's a terrific talent, what a rider, but did bet in a way that was a really serious breach of the rules. But the bigger part of the scandal was the way the sports administrators mishandled or sought to keep that contained during the spring carnival. And people in the system were so frustrated, they came to me rather than actually believing there was a place in the system where they could go, which is really what should happen when we're the end of the road. Mac was probably, was he wrong to call out? Well, I also salute leadership and having people in sporting bodies who people can go to raise issues with, be they a director or someone like Paul, and then we should be encouraging that sort of a culture. If we're not going to have a whistleblower line. They're really simple, practical things. A number you can call where there's someone always on the end of that line
that you can trust,
who's trustworthy, who's trained, who's going to know how to interact with you and protect you and know what to do with your complaint. Every sport should have that in place.
Thank you for your question. Some other questions? We had this gentleman here, then we'll come to you as well. So, sorry, no, I didn't realise you had the microphone.
Cheers. My name's Brenton Holt. Getting towards your point about the whistleblower, you only have to look at the Olympics, the two Russian athletes that gave up their own country, women and men. They didn't get to compete in the Olympics yet. You know, a good probably half of their countrymen did. And I guess in another way, don't you think it's the federation's issues of not having... why can't we start with a life ban for serious drug breaches? You only got to look at the 100-metre final. Justin Gatlin has tested positive twice. You know, I think it's great if the public and athletes are calling them out and really voicing their disapproval. But unless the organisations who, FIFA, IOC, which are more worried about ratings and money coming in, unless they do something about it, and set the level at... I mean, I understand your point before, Catherine, about grey areas in sort of... They took a substance that wasn't banned 2 months earlier, et cetera, et cetera. Well, yeah, you do probably have to have a little bit of leeway, but unless we start with a complete life ban as a starting point, how are we going to deter the other guys from you know, taking the risk, given the rewards available to you if you do succeed and beat the system?
And certainly from a match-fixing side, Declan Hill, who I referred to already, has called for life bans flat out, that from a match-fixing side. So, and I also saw that Michael Phelps from a doping side called for life bans as well during the Rio Games. So there are athletes and there are people in the sports community who would definitely agree with you on that, provided there is the allowance for grey areas, because a life ban is a significant impost. I don't want to put that too lightly. To say that you can't play your sport, you can't earn your living at all is a massive deal, and we have to be really sure that we get it right. And as we've talked about today, we don't always get it right.
And due process in our criminal justice system is based on this idea of redemption as well. You do your time, you can come back. Now, at what point is your doping or your cheating so egregious that you have to give up your passion. I mean, I think there is a point, but it's got to be one hell of a point. Yeah, well, I think you can't just, and this is probably the real problem with the WADA's code is it's too rigid. It captures, it puts everybody in these pigeonholes, and you need to have a lot more. Just as an outsider observing it, and the Essendon case was where I looked on, there was no flexibility, no mitigation. It was outrageous. It was either 2 weeks or 2 years, and there was no sense of justice there. So I think that's got to be driven by number one, justice, and then the deterrence as well, which is what you're talking about. So yeah, but a complicated area.
Nick, is one of the issues that they're running the fine line between the cost of running the system to actually do the detection and the penalties, that they can't spend way too much on it. Actually, you get no return. So they're coming to a system for WADA, which one they can afford, and that's where they're going to stop. And that's one of the issues we've got.
Yeah, absolutely. The amount of money it costs to actually enforce and to oversight continually, I mean, no state will pay for it. But I do think, my experience is not with WADA, but it's simply looking at WADA's treatment of AFL players, which there's nobody, I think, whether you love or loathe the club involved or whatever you think of some of the individuals involved, that thinks that penalty was fair. And that's a problem for teams, not just Essendon, caught up in their similar scandals.
Thanks for your question. I think the gentleman's here.
Thank you, yes. It's Tony Phillips here from the Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation. So I don't know much about doping. I know more about gambling. But I think the first thing, a couple of observations. The first one I'd like to make is just that I think the 90% figure that you're citing, the only place I've seen that come from is gambling industry. Normally it's part of an argument to say they should be allowed to offer more gambling in Australia because they can't compete with what's happening overseas. The actual amount of sports gambling in Australia, the latest figures, it's $815 million of losses a year, which sounds bad. The total losses in Australia on gambling are $22 billion a year, so it's small. The participation in sports gambling in Victoria, the latest figures from 2014, 4.9% of the population, so it's quite small. So who is actually doing the gambling, and why would your figure have some relevance? It would be because criminals are into it, and criminals are betting lots of money, and it might even be that 30% of that 800 million would be being sent overseas by criminals. But the main reason criminals would be getting into gambling is to launder money, not to win. They might get a better percentage of their money laundered if they were able to convince a team to lose. But by and large, they'll get 70 to 80% back, which is quite good, more than they'd have to pay in tax. And that's the reason you use gambling for laundering money, because you don't pay any tax on it, and it becomes clean as soon as you win it. So that's something we haven't even mentioned, is the money laundering. And I guess the final point, which is an interesting point around, we've talked a lot about either players being tempted or players being forced to become corrupt, and we've talked about whether or not the bodies have been, capturing them. But in Australia, anything you can bet on legally in Australia is because the code has allowed that to happen. They've said it's okay to bet on our sport. In return, they get fees. So there's a conflict of interest there that hasn't been explored. And on top of that, the bookmaker comes to them and says, let us bet on your sport, and you say yes, and then the regulator in the state says you can. But then they offer a whole lot of products. So if you're worried about the fact that they're offering bets on no balls, or they're offering bets on who kicks the first goal, the sporting codes can stop that. But I suspect there's so many hundreds of different betting products that are being offered, any normal punter can't keep up with the amount of offers coming through their phone, that nobody's actually able to police that properly at all. And I think that has to be looked at. If you want to look at what's a threat to integrity, the sporting bodies have a role to play.
Well, it's interesting because in the AFL, they were doing their best to try to outlaw in-game betting within the regulated sports betting markets, weren't they?
Yeah, I think so.
So you couldn't bet on who was going to kick the next goal, or
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think you're right with the regulated betting market, and maybe the 90% number's wrong, but how would you know? Neither you and I would know, but what I can say is that in India, which is a far bigger market than this one, it is illegal to bet. So it's all with the illegal bookies. In America, it's illegal to bet on sports. So it's all with the illegal bookies. So markets that are far bigger than ours, that's where the money is going. And it's all good and well to control it with the governing body, but if people are going to go offshore and they're going to take up betting options that the sports bets, the regulated bookies don't take, that's actually incentivising them to go towards these sort of bookies. So look, it's a complex space, but it is run by criminals, this space, and I've seen it firsthand. They are doing what they can to get their hooks into athletes.
And the money laundering aspect of it, that connection that brings together organised crime and sport that the Crime Commission was talking about, is a key component of why it's such an attractive domain for organised crime.
Yeah, absolutely massive. And it's a very, very complicated problem. I take it you're probably not a fan of gambling, but we also look at prohibition and say that prohibition of alcohol failed. Are we better to try to get markets like India to regulate, to capture more of the market in a way that we can somehow control? No, well, it's impossible to manage, but if we outlaw it, we drive it underground. So there's no easy answer. And it is. I mean, but we do have to have the best systems in place, and you can actually monitor offshore, underground betting markets, unregulated betting markets, because money's got to move at some point. Cash money's got to go into a system at some point. It costs a huge amount of money. It requires governments to work together, but that's certainly a law enforcement and international government response that's got to be taken place, and that is happening around the world through these global agencies that are looking at principally money laundering, and they're seeing these huge gaming markets and they're attacking it through that way as well. So, it's piecemeal, they're just squeezing water, but it is happening, and it is a tremendous problem. You're totally spot on to point it out.
And the amount of money is staggering that's involved here. It's extraordinary. When you think about just how much money is sloshing around. Have we got any more questions from the floor? We have this gentleman that will come to you.
Yeah. Good evening, Sam Erdican. I'm a current sworn member of the Victoria Police Force. So, as far as gambling is concerned, in sport, it is a greater issue than drugs itself. Being a lover of, obviously, soccer, if you have a look at the EPL teams, out of the 20 teams, probably 18 are sponsored by major gambling agencies. So in Australia, is it working? Yeah, in Australia also, in order to alleviate the problem of gambling in sport, I think starting with the state government, you need to obviously abolish sponsorship with major sporting codes. That's where it's got to begin, from the top. Just like the state government itself is addicted to the gambling revenue through pokies and all other avenues of gambling, a lot of the sporting clubs are reliant on the gambling agency sponsorships. So,
and also the other side of that is any number of AFL clubs have huge, and this isn't illegal gambling, but they have huge revenue streams from poker machines as well. Lots of money. That's
right, and there's a moral dilemma there. At the moment, I think Collingwood Football Club, North Melbourne Football Club, something like 45% of their revenue is generated through the pokies.
Not North Melbourne. North Melbourne is the one AFL club that has a no poker machine policy, but the Hawthorn Football Club and certainly has a huge number of poker machines. The Carlton Football Club through Bruce Matheson and his largesse has also got access to huge poker machines.
It's nowhere near 45%. No. It might be, at most, it might be 10%.
Yeah, so I just want to get your view on this, on Paul, being the AFL Players Association president. Do you see any time in the near future the AFL clubs, 18 clubs, basically cutting ties with the gambling agencies as their sponsors, or the AFL itself?
I think that started to happen. There's a number of clubs have walked away from those relationships in the last 12 months. I think that'll probably happen. I think pokies, as Francis said, may be a bigger issue. They have become an important revenue stream, and the AFL economy would change quite drastically if they weren't there. So I think they're insidious. And I'm not sure we should be taking money from the community in this way, but it's going to be very difficult to turn that around. So I'm not sure what the future there is, but I think in terms of sports betting and sponsorship, that they will disappear at some point.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, Russell, I know from the St Kilda Football Club and the research they did into their relationship with Centrebet for a couple of years, that when they looked at the brand profile of the football club at the time, because of their and at the time was a very highly visual association with Centrebet, that it did them enormous damage in the eyes of their constituency that they had chosen that sponsorship. And in the end, the money wasn't worth the trust that it burnt between the fan base and the club.
Yeah, if you do surveys of most members of professional sporting clubs, they'll say 3 things you shouldn't be sponsoring: gambling, alcohol and junk food. And that comes out consistently according to crossable codes. So those things do hurt the brand, but it's the commercial reality, as Nick mentioned before, around keeping a revenue stream. And for an AFL club and the league itself, the gambling revenues in various forms, through sponsorship, gaming machine revenues and product fees from wagering markets, the second largest component of revenue next to broadcast rights. So it's a commercial reality that most sports have shifted down that path, and it's really hard to draw back from that path.
Thank you for your question.
No problem. Thanks for taking my question. My name's Nathan. I work at La Trobe University. I had a quick question just for the whole panel. That we've talked a little bit tonight about players being susceptible to, particularly with gambling or with match fixing issues at a federation level with Russia. But I'm particularly interested in, I know I'm a big soccer fan, and I do see that there are some instances in which there are some very big decisions on the field that an official has maybe some level of, I suppose that they need to make some decisions on the field, and you would think to yourself, oh, maybe that particular instance does seem a little bit suspicious. And I was just wondering for the panel, if they've seen some, what level of issue is there in Australian sport where officialdom's in trouble with this, with gambling and match fixing?
That's a good point. We haven't talked about the officials. We've talked a lot about players because Paul's here, but in your investigation, have you come across that sort of tampering?
What a free kick to talk about footy umpires. Great. I think we probably far better. There's been corrupt referees. We've seen them overseas in football. I've certainly never heard of that in Australia. I think, the AFL has a very professional umpires association, but clearly, it's a risk, and so what you're identifying is spot on. So it's something you've got to be totally aware of. And I guess when you drop your guard and think it's will be fine, it's when you'll be exposed. Is it happening overseas? There's some extraordinary tales of referees picking up suitcases of money and being bought by gangsters.
Prostitutes.
So it's certainly happening, and it is a risk. But my sense is in Australia, it's pretty okay.
I think in the Serie A in Italy for a long time there in the 90s, it was a massive issue.
It's a number of team sports. So we've heard claims about it in handball, volleyball, basketball. As well as football and cricket, because of course it's the simplest thing to do. You only have to pay off one. If you're going to have to pay off part of the football team, like in the Southern Stars scenario, then you're going to have to talk to the goalkeeper, maybe somebody in defence, somebody up the front, hopefully to get them all in line. If you're just going to make sure that what you're betting on is the red cards, the penalties, even the score, sometimes the referee can help to sway that. So if that's only one person you have to pay off, then you're doing quite well. And that's been an argument from Declan Hill to have more female referees, incidentally, because his argument is that they don't get paid off quite so easily. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I buy that. I think that's just been a lack of opportunity. A Gucci handbag and a pair of Prada shoes might do the same trick. I'm not sure.
Might just have to pay them a bit more. Look, I'm certainly aware of, not in Australia, but one overseas example where a player actually reported to me, and we took that forward to the ICC. That umpire is no longer, I'm sure there are others that picked up on this, but that umpire is no longer involved. So I'm certainly aware of one, but other than that, no.
Thanks for your question. I think that might be... No, there is a question up the back. Yes, hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, my name's Liz Seddon. I've got a question for Nick. Nick, you obviously do a lot of investigative work and reporting on corporate corruption and we saw, I think today, there was an article that you're responsible for in The Age about bribery and corruption in Congo. To what extent do you see parallels? I know today's debate's about bribery and corruption in sport, but to what extent have you seen parallels between the bribery and corruption that you're seeing in the corporates and the sport? And then secondly, do you think that sporting bodies here could benefit from adopting some of the practices that corporates are? So, for example, we see ASIC is beating its drum at the moment about corporate culture, bad culture, leads to bad behaviours, and they've got various requirements such as transparency, which we've talked about, whistleblowing, and we've talked about being free to speak up, and also tone from the top, and the fish rots from the head type scenario. Do you think that sporting bodies here could benefit from the steps that corporates are taking in Australia to improve their corporate culture, which I think at the end of the day is one of the big issues for sporting organisations? You have to improve your culture, and I think that's one of the ways forward and a solution. Long question, can you answer that?
That opens up an interesting point. I mean, I'm not so sure I'd say many corporate cultures are healthier than sporting cultures. I mean, that we've seen terrible examples of corporate culture across the world. There's obviously similarities because sport's globalised, business is globalised. They're all driven. I mean, money is a massive driver in both. I guess the advantage that business has is that there is a longer system, say in the Commonwealth, where the way corporations operate are governed by laws that have been in place for many, many years, and systems of oversight. And because business is such an important part of our culture and our society, it is the subject of far more scrutiny and debate than perhaps sport has been. Sport's been professionalising relatively recently, business for a longer period of time. So certainly there is some things that you can learn from the business world in terms, I think, of better. In Australia, whistleblowers are treated like crap in businesses. I suspect they're treated even worse in sporting clubs. So I'm not so sure we should be following business's lead, but it is in some areas probably a little bit ahead of sport. But where I'd say sport is well ahead of business is sport's originating ethos is competition in a healthy way to achieve personal achievement and to I'm being naive here. Business has always been about money. So in that respect, it's got a far more corrupting influence that's been perhaps undermining it. But it's a good point, and it makes you think about how you can apply, I guess, different learnings from both. And the core thing that both need to do, this is a really meaningless, nebulous statement, but it's culture. Have champion cultures of integrity. That's what it's all about. And the laws are the byproduct of a lack of culture. We've got to be leading from the front, and that's what. That's the positive focus. That's what we all should be talking about. And unfortunately, I spend too much time talking about how to catch the bad guys rather than how to encourage people to be good. I'm not sure if that my answer was like your question, I think.
We tell our clients that they need to have good whistleblower policies in place so they don't go to you.
Yeah, I always say to people, you don't want people coming to the media. I mean, we're really important in sport because we keep people like Francis and Caroline Wilson keep sporting businesses, which they are now, honest. But you don't want, and this is really, there should never be a time where a player who feels like they can't trust a coach or an administrator to talk about what a teammate's doing, gambling on the weekend or using drugs, that they need to go to a journalist. As soon as that happens, the system fails. So, I mean, that's I don't want to be going out of business. I won't be anytime soon, I can assure you. But that's, ideally, you want people who can feel comfortable to report. Again, the other thing just makes me despondent after 15 years as a journalist is just saying even institutions I have a lot of faith in, run by good people who instinctively cover up, not because they're bad people, but that's what institutions do when they get the spinners in and they put their heads down and say, this won't come out. So again, the theme there is accountability. That's what's really got to be, if you muck up, do a mea culpa, open up your books, if you're going to allow gambling, make sure it's done in the most accountable way possible. That's...
Well, how do you make the International Olympic Committee accountable, for example? This is the challenge in sport, isn't it? Because you can say, well, in Australia we have an accountability system because we have the Australian Sports Commission. They have the funding, so there's a carrot and there's a stick. But at the international level, who's making who accountable? And in order to change anything, to create a scenario of greater transparency, greater accountability, then you'd have to have essentially the turkeys voting on Christmas, which is really a difficult scenario where you have people that are going to have to vote themselves out of office or to have codes of ethics put in place to govern their behaviour and to change the culture if there is something like that, because otherwise, who do they answer to?
In the end, they answer to the people, I think, who watch sport and hopefully keep them honest by asking hard questions about them. That's about as good as we can do. And that's about all we've got for you up here. It's been an enlightening conversation. Can you please thank our panellists, Nick McKenzie, Catherine Ordway, Paul Marsh and Professor Russell Hoye. And thank you for coming along. If you want to view this and listen through this again, I'm sure it'll be up on the Bold Thinking website and you'll be able to catch the video. Or if you loved it, you can watch the replay, like a footy game. But otherwise, we're back in action on the 22nd of September with our next event, which we'll tell you more about in the next coming along. But thank you for coming along tonight. Thank you. Hey, Catherine, that was great.
Thank you very much.
We, like millions, are survivors of civil war. And we know all too well that peace does not begin simply because civil war ends. A peace treaty, a piece of paper alone, does not bring peace. It does not take back what has been seen, what has been said, what has been done, or take back what the war has changed. In our streets, in our homes, in our hearts, it does not undo the suffering. For many reasons, there is still fear for our future and the future of our families. Yes, the war might be over, but the struggle to find peace continues. Many peace processes fail. Perhaps because when peace is thought of as a process, we forget that what we are talking about is people, who for many just want to love and to live and to prosper. We, like millions, are survivors of civil war, but real peace is more than simply just surviving. It is a shared focus on a tomorrow that benefits all.